Fear does not always arrive with a scream. It does not always announce itself as panic or paralysis or dread. Sometimes fear arrives wearing a suit. It introduces itself as caution. It speaks in the language of responsibility, of maturity, of hard-won wisdom. It says things like, "I am simply being realistic, and I cannot afford to hope right now, and I must protect what little I have." It sounds so reasonable that you applaud it. You call it discernment. You call it groundedness. You let it sit at the head of your table and make every financial decision from that seat. And the whole time, it is quietly sealing the door through which your supply was trying to enter. Wallace Wattles understood something that most people are never taught, something that the spiritual traditions he drew from tried to say again and again in language that modern minds have reduced to decoration on a wall. Fear is not harmless when it becomes the ruling state of your consciousness. Fear does not simply observe lack. Fear participates in lack. Fear tells the invisible supply, "Do not come closer." It does not do this loudly. It does not do this through obvious unbelief. It does it through the steady, quiet accumulation of contraction, suspicion, and withdrawal. And today that hidden operation is going to be named, exposed, and displaced. Think about the last time you checked your bank balance. Notice what happened in your body before you even saw the number. There was a tightening, was there not? A bracing, a small preparation for disappointment. And after you saw the number, regardless of whether it was better or worse than expected, there was still a residue of unease that did not fully leave. That is the body of a person living under financial fear. Not someone without faith, not someone without desire, not someone who refuses to believe in abundance, but someone whose emotional daily experience is governed by the nervous certainty that things will not be enough, that the supply will not come, that the next blow is already on its way. You believe in the source when you are in prayer. You return to abundance language when you are reading, when you are watching, when you are in the company of spiritual community. But then a bill arrives, or a client disappears, or a payment is delayed, and the fear returns before the faith can speak. You delay decisions because certainty has not arrived. You avoid opportunities because the risk feels larger than the reward. You hoard small amounts because you have stopped trusting that more is possible. And all of this, every single pattern of contraction, you have labeled not as fear, but as wisdom. You have been protecting yourself with a wall and calling the wall a virtue. The deepest pain in this is not the financial scarcity itself. The deepest pain is the confusion between the fear and the guidance. You have spent years thinking that your caution was your compass, that your anxiety was your advisor, that your contraction was keeping you safe. You have trusted fear the way a student trusts a teacher. You have followed its instructions the way a soldier follows orders. And all the while, the invisible supply that Wattles and the masters described was not absent. It was present. But it was meeting a receiver who had been taught, slowly, convincingly, and without malice, to remain closed. Wallace Wattles was not a man writing poetry about abundance. He was a man writing laws. The science of getting rich, the work for which he is best remembered, was not a comfort book. It was a precise manual about how minds either cooperate with the creative intelligence behind all supply or how they obstruct it. Wattles was direct about attention. He taught that you cannot hold your mind fixed upon the poverty of your present condition and expect prosperity to replace it, because the attention you give to any condition is the signal that tells the formless substance what to create. And in his understanding, fear is the most potent form of attention that a person can give to the unwanted. Wattles taught about the formless substance, the intelligent supply that underlies all visible wealth, all visible resource, all visible opportunity. He taught that this substance responds to the mental image held with faith, not to the anxious calculation held in terror. When a person dominates their inner state with fear, they are not holding the image of wealth. They are holding the image of its absence. They are not signaling the source to create through them. They are signaling their own inability to receive what is already moving toward them. This is the teaching that most students of Wattles collect intellectually and then undo emotionally every single morning before breakfast. Today, this script is a sustained confrontation with that gap, the gap between what you believe in principle and what you practice in fear. The gap between the wealth you have declared possible and the terror that quietly governs every real financial moment. By the end of this teaching, you will be able to identify the fear, name its disguises, understand its mechanism, interrupt its authority, and return to the source with the kind of calm faith that Wallace Wattles recognized as the only creative state in which supply can be received. That is the promise. It will not be shallow. It will not be comfortable at every moment. But it will be true. The visible world is not neutral. Every morning, before you have said a single spiritual word, the visible world has already spoken. The number on the screen, the bill in the envelope, the silence from a potential client, the delay from a payment you were expecting. The visible world delivers its report constantly, persistently, and loudly, and it does not prefix its report with, "This is only what is currently manifested." It simply shows you what is visible, and then it waits to see whether you will interpret it as reality or as temporary condition. Almost every person trained by ordinary life and ordinary thinking chooses reality. And in that choice, fear is reborn every single day. When the account balance is lower than you need, there is something that happens in the body that is faster than thought. Before you have reasoned about it, before you have prayed about it, the body has already registered danger. This is the tightening of the chest, the shallow breath, the slight trembling in the hands. The nervous system does not distinguish between a predator in the forest and a number on a screen. It reads both as threat, and when threat is registered, the entire system moves into contraction. Perception narrows, options disappear from view. The mind begins to calculate around the threat rather than to open toward the solution. And then fear becomes the interpreter of everything else. Not just the bank balance, but every piece of incoming information is now filtered through the conclusion that danger is present. A slow day becomes evidence of permanent decline. A rejection becomes proof of unworthiness. A closed door becomes confirmation that the source has turned away. Fear does not simply observe the evidence. Fear builds a case from the evidence, and then it presents that case with the authority of a verdict. This is what the visible world does when fear is allowed to be its translator. The mind, receiving this translated verdict, begins to construct a future from it. It predicts collapse. It maps out worst-case outcomes. It rehearses catastrophe with extraordinary detail and energy, spending hours in a future that has not arrived, preparing for losses that have not occurred, grieving resources that have not been taken. And it calls this process prudence. It calls it planning. It calls it being responsible so that you are not caught off guard. But what it is, stripped of every polite name, is creative energy applied to the construction of lack. The mind is building the future it fears most, using the laws of mind that Wattles described, but aimed in the direction of the unwanted. What happens next is that the viewer begins to make decisions from within this contracted state. They do not pursue the opportunity that has just appeared, because their contracted mind cannot evaluate it clearly. The threat filter has made every unknown look dangerous. They do not reach out to the potential collaborator, because the fear has pre-written the rejection. They do not raise their prices, send the proposal, make the call, or say yes to the unfamiliar door, because every one of those actions requires a trust that fear has evacuated from the premises. The contraction is now directing behavior, and behavior shaped by contraction will not produce expansion. The deepest cruelty of the visible supply trap is that it is self-reinforcing. When you make contracted decisions from a state of fear, you tend to produce contracted results, which then provide more visible evidence to justify more fear, which produces more contraction, which narrows options further. The cycle is not the fault of the source. The source has not left. The invisible supply has not dried up. But a person cycling through visible world fear and fear-based decision-making is progressively less able to perceive or act upon the channels through which supply is moving. They are not being punished. They are simply closed. And here is a truth that Wattles would want stated plainly. Money cannot enter a life whose receiver has been sealed shut by terror. This is not a poetic statement. It is a statement about mechanism. If you are in a state of contraction, you will not perceive the channels. You will not trust the unusual opportunity. You will not act on the inspiration. You will not receive the unexpected offer. You will not say yes to the collaboration. All of the avenues through which the invisible supply could move into your visible life require a degree of openness, recognition, and trust that fear systematically destroys. This is the visible supply trap in its fullness. The viewer prays for change. The visible world speaks. Fear interprets. Prediction forms. Decisions contract. Results narrow. Evidence mounts. Fear strengthens. The prayer continues, but the receiver remains closed. And the person sitting in the middle of this cycle genuinely believes that the source has stopped answering. They do not see that the answer may have arrived at the door already, and that fear was the one refusing to open it. That is the trap. And today you are walking out of it. Before we go further, there is something this moment calls for. Not as a mechanical action, not as a performance for an algorithm, but as a spiritual act of replacement. You have been letting fear define what is possible. You have been letting fear name your source. Right now, in this moment, that changes. If you are ready to stop letting fear sit at the head of your table and define the limits of your supply, type in the comments these exact words. Fear is not my source. Say it there. Say it as a declaration. Say it as the beginning of a different inner agreement. When you type those words, you are not typing a sentence. You are issuing a correction. You are interrupting a pattern that may have been running beneath your decisions for years. The comment is a spoken order in written form, and the masters understood that spoken orders carry creative weight. Florence Scovel Shinn spent her entire teaching life on this principle. The words you say and the words you write carry the frequency of what you are choosing, so choose. Fear is not my source. Post that. And then stay with this teaching, because we are only beginning to go deep. The emotional cost of living under financial fear is rarely counted because it does not appear on any invoice. It does not show up as a visible debt. But it is paid every single day in the currency of inner life, in the quiet depletion of energy, vitality, and creative capacity that happens when a person must carry constant dread as an internal companion. The body under chronic financial fear is a body in a state of emergency. The muscles hold tension, the jaw is tight, the shoulders are elevated, the stomach is never completely settled. This is not metaphor. This is physiology responding to the signal that danger is permanently present. Sleep is the first casualty. The mind that has been trained by fear to predict disaster will not easily permit rest. It will return in the early hours of the morning or in the space between waking and sleep to rehearse the threats it did not finish processing during the day. 3 in the morning becomes the hour of financial catastrophe planning. The mind runs its calculations over unpaid bills, uncertain income, insufficient savings, and approaching expenses, and it does this not because it is solving anything, but because fear has convinced it that vigilance equals safety. This is one of the most painful lies fear tells, that if you think about the problem long enough and hard enough, you will finally secure yourself against it. Shame travels with financial fear like a silent companion. It does not announce itself. It whispers. It says things like, you should have been further along by now, and a person your age should not be in this position, and other people manage their money better than you do. It compares constantly. It measures against every visible success it can find and uses that measurement to confirm inadequacy. And because the viewer believes the comparison is accurate, they carry the conclusion, which is not simply that their finances are limited, but that they are limited, that there is something fundamentally broken in them that money recognizes and avoids. One of fear's most reliable behaviors is the management of accounts through extremes. There are people who check their balance dozens of times a day, not because checking helps, but because fear has convinced them that surveillance is a form of control. And there are people who cannot look at their accounts at all, who let statements pile up unopened, who avoid the financial picture entirely because the thought of what they might find has been made unbearable by fear. Both behaviors are fear. Both the obsessive checking and the determined avoidance are the same fear in 2 different disguises, and neither one of them has ever made a single cent arrive. Fear around money produces a contraction around asking. There is an enormous population of spiritually sincere people who genuinely cannot bring themselves to ask. They cannot ask for the raise they deserve. They cannot ask for the support that is being offered. They cannot ask the question that might open the door. Fear has made asking feel like exposure, like admission of need, like a kind of nakedness that invites judgment or rejection. So they suffer in silence, waiting for their needs to be met by people who somehow sense what they need without being told, and they call this independence. But it is fear, fear of being seen, fear of being refused, fear of being evaluated and found wanting. The inability to receive is perhaps the most spiritually poignant consequence of financial fear. Receiving requires openness. It requires a belief, even a small one, that you are worthy of what is coming, that what is arriving is safe to accept, that more is not dangerous. But fear has done such thorough work on the psyche of the person living under it that receiving itself becomes threatening. An unexpected gift produces suspicion. An unusual opportunity produces doubt. An offer of help produces the reflex to decline. The person who lives under financial fear has developed a receiving reflex that says no before the mind has even evaluated the offer, and then calls the refusal prudence. Anger at wealthy people is a symptom that financial fear often conceals beneath a layer of moral language. There is a person who tells themselves they object to wealth concentration on ethical grounds, and that may be partly true, but beneath it there is often the hot, unexamined resentment of someone who has been denied something they want and cannot reconcile that desire with their identity. Fear about money sometimes converts to judgment of money, because it is less painful to condemn the thing you cannot have than to face the terror of your own believing limitation. Wattles was direct about this. Contempt for the rich is contempt for the wealth you are asking to receive. Guilt for wanting more is a more subtle companion. Many spiritually sincere people who genuinely love their faith and their relationship with the source, carry an unspoken belief that wanting wealth is a spiritual failing. They have absorbed from somewhere in their formation the idea that the truly holy person is indifferent to money, and that wanting financial increase is a sign of materialism, attachment, or shallow faith. So they approach abundance teachings with one hand extended and one hand behind their back, unable to fully receive because a part of them believes that wanting fully is itself a sin. This is not spiritual maturity. This is fear wearing the robes of piety. The social shrinking that financial fear produces over time is one of the most damaging long-term effects that almost nobody names. The person under financial fear begins to make themselves smaller in almost every domain, not just financially, but socially, professionally, creatively, spiritually. They stop pursuing, they stop proposing, they stop reaching, they stop risking visibility. They maintain the lowest profile that allows them to avoid the kind of exposure that might invite judgment or failure. And they call this humility. They call this realism. They call this not getting ahead of themselves. But it is a life being edited down by fear, paragraph by paragraph, until what remains is a carefully managed minimum. And they call the minimum safety. The final and perhaps most important emotional cost is this. The life under financial fear is a life in which the source has been replaced. Not replaced by an idol, not replaced by anything visible. Replaced by fear itself. Fear becomes the ruling presence. Fear sets the agenda. Fear determines what is possible. Fear defines the boundaries of the life. And the source, the infinite, intelligent, inexhaustible source that Wattles described, has been moved to the periphery, consulted in prayer, visited on Sundays, invoked in moments of crisis, but not trusted as the central, daily, governing reality of life. That is the full emotional cost. And that is exactly what this teaching is here to reverse. Wallace Wattles wrote with unusual clarity about where the mind must dwell if a person intends to create wealth through the laws of the formless substance. He was not writing about affirmations as decoration. He was not suggesting that the student occasionally think positive thoughts to offset a general background of anxiety. He was describing a sustained, deliberate, conscious act of mental direction, the practice of holding the mind upon the image of what is desired with enough consistency and faith that the creative intelligence behind all visible supply begins to move that image into form. He called it the certain way, and the certain way requires that the mind stop meditating on poverty. This is the teaching that is most frequently softened, most frequently diluted, and most frequently left out of the popular presentations of Wattles's work. People love the idea that there is invisible supply. People love the idea that formless substance is responsive to thought. But they resist the practical implication, which is that their habitual attention to the problem, their daily rehearsal of lack, their constant mental inventory of what is missing and what is threatened and what is not yet arrived, is not neutral. It is creative. It is feeding direction to the same creative intelligence they are asking to produce wealth. You cannot petition the source with one hand and sustain a poverty meditation with the other, and expect the source to honor the petition over the louder, more emotionally charged signal of the sustained fear. Attention is direction. This is the simplest and most profound practical truth in Wattles's entire body of work. Where you place your sustained attention is where you are pointing the creative capacity of your mind. And the mind in partnership with the formless substance will tend to create in the direction of its dominant attention. This means that a person who wakes every morning and immediately inventories their visible lack, counts their debts, rehearses their fears, and predicts their deficiencies is using the law correctly in the wrong direction. The law does not ask for your belief in it. The law simply operates, and it operates upon whatever dominant impression your consciousness is producing. Fear gives sustained attention to the unwanted. This is its mechanism. Fear does not simply notice danger and move past it. Fear installs danger as a central recurring mental focus. It returns to the threat repeatedly. It elaborates the threat with detail. It imagines the full unfolding of the feared outcome. It rehearses responses to the worst case. And all of this mental activity, which the fearful mind believes is protective, is in terms of the creative law exactly the kind of dominant, emotionally charged attention that Wattles described as creative. The person living under financial fear is creating constantly. They are simply creating in the direction they do not want to go. Gratitude, for Wattles, was not sentiment, it was technology. It was the specific practice of redirecting sustained attention from absence to presence, from what is lacking to what is already here, from the threat to the supply that has already arrived in however small a form. Gratitude recalibrates the attention signal. It tells the formless substance that the receiver recognizes what has been given, and in that recognition opens further to the giving. This is why Wattles emphasized it so firmly. It was not because gratitude is pleasant, though it often is. It was because gratitude is one of the only reliable methods of interrupting fear's dominance over attention and restoring the direction of creative mental energy toward wealth rather than poverty. Faith in Wattles's teaching is not the opposite of doubt. It is not the suppression of uncertainty. Faith, as Wattles applied it, is the stabilization of attention on the desired outcome, despite the contrary evidence of the visible world. It is the practice of holding the image steady when the account is low, when the client has not appeared, when the door has not opened, when every visible signal suggests that the supply is not coming. Faith is what keeps the mental image consistent enough for the formless substance to work with it. And the enemy of faith in this practical sense is not doubt as an abstract concept. The enemy of faith is fear, which constantly disrupts the image with contrary predictions. Action, in the certain way, serves a specific purpose that is often misunderstood. Action does not create supply through force. Action redirects attention. When you act in the direction of your desired outcome, with the calm certainty that the source is providing through the channels that are open to you, you are performing two functions simultaneously. You are moving physically through the world in a way that meets and cooperates with the channels the source is using. And you are affirming to your own consciousness, with the language of behavior, that you believe the supply is real. Action done from faith redirects attention from the threat to the movement toward the good. The viewer who has been reading Wattles, speaking abundance language, attending teachings, and listening to this channel while continuing to meditate on their poverty every morning must hear this clearly and without cruelty. The law is operating. The source has not failed. The formless substance has not become deaf to your desire. But the dominant signal your consciousness is sending is not the signal of wealth received. It is the signal of wealth feared to be absent. And the source, which responds to mental images held with faith, is receiving a very clear, very consistent, very emotionally charged impression of lack. The reversal does not require perfection. It requires a genuine, sustained shift in what you give your dominant attention to. It begins today. Let us disrupt a belief that has been living inside you for so long that it has become invisible. The belief that fear keeps you safe. The belief that the anxious scanning of your financial situation, the constant assessment of danger, the perpetual worst-case planning, is a form of responsible self-protection that a person of sense would be foolish to abandon. This belief is not only wrong, in the context of the laws Wattles described, it is catastrophically counterproductive, and yet it is one of the most persistently defended beliefs among spiritually sincere people who cannot understand why their abundance practice is not working. Fear has a legitimate and small function. There is a moment in which a true warning, a genuine signal that something requires your attention or correction, serves a useful purpose. If you are about to sign a contract with deeply unfavorable terms, a feeling of caution that prompts you to reread it is useful. If you are about to make a financial commitment you genuinely cannot honor, a moment of honest assessment is useful. Fear as a bell has its place. A bell rings to alert you. You respond. You address what needs addressing. And then the bell stops. The bell does not live on your mantelpiece and ring every waking hour. The bell does not govern your household. The bell does not make every decision. But what has happened in the life of someone under chronic financial fear is that the bell has been crowned. Fear, which was meant to be a brief signal, has been elevated to the throne of the inner life. It no longer merely alerts, it commands. It does not raise a question and wait for wisdom to answer. It raises a question and then answers itself with the worst possible response. And every decision, every opportunity, every relationship, every channel that appears is evaluated by the crowned fear and usually found threatening. You may hear fear as a bell. You must not crown it as a king. Wattles understood that the formless substance does not cooperate with the mind that is governed by fear, because a mind governed by fear cannot hold the clear, faith-filled mental image that the creative process requires. Fear smears the image. It introduces distortion, doubt, counter-images, and worst-case overlays that disrupt the clean mental signal that supply needs to move toward. Think of it this way. You are trying to send a precise order to the invisible supply, a clear, specific, emotionally certain image of the financial condition you desire. But fear is standing behind you with ink, writing over the order as fast as you write it, substituting the image of the threat for the image of the desire. The order that the source receives is not the order you intended. It is the fear. Fear can point to a concern. Fear cannot become your source. This is the distinction that changes everything. The person who has mastered this distinction does not become reckless. They do not abandon discernment. They do not ignore genuine signals. But they have learned to hear the concern, address what can practically be addressed, and then return to their source-centered inner state. They do not let the concern metastasize into a governing terror that takes over the entire organism and directs every decision. They take the useful information from the fear signal and then consciously, deliberately, with practiced intention, return to the inner state of trust. That return is not naive. That return is the practice of the master. The belief that fear protects you financially is particularly stubborn because there is a way in which it appears to be validated by experience. The person who has been burned by a bad financial decision, who has trusted someone who disappeared with their money, who has invested in something that failed, has evidence that caution was warranted, and that evidence now justifies the entire architecture of fear that has been built since then. But there is a difference between the wisdom gained from experience and the fearful contraction that makes use of that experience to seal off the entire system from every future possibility. One is learning, the other is imprisonment, and fear is expert at making the prison look like it was built for your protection. Somewhere in you, there is a sincere spiritual person who has read Wattles and James Allen and heard teachings about faith and abundance, and who genuinely wants to trust the source. And somewhere in that same person, there is an old, loyal, exhausted fear that has been keeping watch for years, telling itself that the moment the vigil ends is the moment disaster arrives. That fear does not need to be shamed. It does not need to be attacked, but it needs to be told clearly with the authority of your own spiritual understanding. You are not the source. You are not the provider. You are not the one keeping this life together. The source does that. And I'm returning to the source now. You may hear fear, you must not crown it. You may receive the signal, you must not obey it as law. Fear is useful as a bell and deadly as a throne. That is not poetry. That is a precise description of what has been happening in the inner life of every person who has faith on their lips and fear in the seat of their decisions. The disruption begins by naming it. And you have named it now. There is a specific kind of fear that this teaching has not yet named. It is not the obvious fear of poverty, not the raw panic that arrives when the account is empty and the rent is due. That fear is uncomfortable, but at least it is recognizable. The fear we are building toward naming is subtler. It is a fear that has been given prestige. It is a fear that has been praised by people whose opinions you respect. It is a fear that the spiritual community itself often validates without realizing what it is validating. And we will arrive at its full exposure before this teaching ends. This fear looks wise. It looks like the mark of a mature person who has stopped being naive, stopped being reckless, stopped making the optimistic mistakes of youth. Society applauds it. Mentors recommend it. Certain religious traditions have confused it with humility. Certain philosophical traditions have confused it with realism. And the people who carry this fear most loyally are often the most sincere, the most spiritually devoted, the most earnest in their desire to align with what is true and good. They have simply accepted a very old, very convincing lie in a very noble costume. This fear sounds mature because it avoids embarrassment. The person carrying it does not take the risk that might result in public failure. They do not pursue the thing that might expose them to judgment or ridicule. They do not step into visibility or expansion or the kind of increase that would invite scrutiny. And because the avoidance is consistent and quiet, it never creates the dramatic failure that would make its cost obvious. The cost is paid instead in the form of the life that was never lived, the opportunity that was never taken, the supply that arrived at a door the person had decided to keep permanently locked. This fear avoids asking. The person who carries it will not ask for what they need. They will not ask for the price they deserve. They will not ask for the collaboration, the opportunity, the support, the second chance. They will construct elaborate justifications for why asking is inappropriate, presumptuous, or unseemly. They will say they do not want to be a burden. They will say they prefer to wait until it is offered. They will say that asking reveals a lack of faith in the source to provide without being petitioned. But beneath all of these spiritual-sounding reasons, the reality is simpler and older than any of them. They are afraid of the answer. They are afraid of the no. And they have decided without examining the decision that the no would be more devastating than the lifetime of not asking. This fear avoids receiving. Even when the supply arrives, the person under this prestige fear finds ways to deflect it. They minimize the gift. They discount the opportunity. They set it aside to consider later, which in their case means never. They find reasons why this particular delivery does not count, is not quite right, does not match their expectation, or cannot be trusted. And in the tradition of Wattles, this is not a minor spiritual oversight. This is a receiving error of the highest order. The supply was not absent. The source was not unwilling. The receiver was closed by a fear so established that it had forgotten it was fear at all. This fear keeps the person small. And small in this context does not mean humble in the healthy sense. Small means contracted. It means operating within a carefully maintained perimeter that is small enough to feel surveyable and controllable. Within that perimeter, the person manages what is visible, guards what is known, and carefully never extends beyond the boundary that their fear has set. They call the boundary sensible limits. They call it knowing their place. They call it not getting above themselves. And the perimeter shrinks, imperceptibly but reliably every year they obey it. Because fear's definition of safety is always slightly smaller than it was the year before. This fear calls smallness safety. It dresses contraction in the language of contentment. It uses the vocabulary of simplicity and modesty and sufficiency to justify what is, in the deeper current of the person's inner life, the terror of expansion. Because expansion is unknown. Expansion is uncontrolled. Expansion invites comparison and scrutiny, and the possibility of loss at a level the person has not previously experienced. And fear, which has always preferred the familiar discomfort to the unfamiliar possibility, will choose the small, known, controllable life every time it is allowed to make the choice. We will name this fear fully before the end of this teaching. It has been called many things by many people. Wattles would have called it the interference that prevents the formless substance from receiving a clear creative signal. Florence Scovel Shinn would have called it the spoken and unspoken agreement that keeps prosperity at arm's length. James Allen would have called it the inner condition that the outer life is accurately reflecting. Whatever name it carries, its exposure is the beginning of its displacement. Keep listening. The full naming is coming. The invisible supply that Wattles described is not a poetic abstraction. It is his best language for a reality he observed operating beneath and behind every visible expression of wealth. The formless substance, as he called it, is the intelligent creative medium through which all visible supply comes into form. It responds to mental states. It moves through channels. It arrives in the visible world through circumstances, people, opportunities, ideas, and situations that the receiving mind has been prepared to recognize and act upon. The key word in that sentence is prepared. And preparation is not a matter of strategy. It is a matter of inner state. Fear narrows perception. This is not metaphorical. When the organism is in a state of fear, the actual range of what it can perceive and process contracts. Possibilities that a calm, open mind would recognize are invisible to the fearful mind. Not because they are absent, but because the fearful mind has been filtered by its own threat assessment priorities to see only what confirms the danger it is anticipating. The person in financial fear does not see the open channel before them. They see the danger on either side of it. They have become, through sustained practice of fear, perceptually unable to recognize the very supply they are asking for. Fear rejects channels. When the invisible supply does begin to move through an unfamiliar or unexpected channel, the fearful mind immediately applies its threat filter to the incoming signal. Is this safe? Is this guaranteed? Is this what I expected? Is this the shape of delivery I was watching for? And when the channel is unexpected, which the channels of invisible supply very frequently are, the fear produces suspicion, hesitation, or outright rejection. The person prays for supply and then refuses the delivery because the delivery service did not match the image they had constructed of how supply ought to arrive. This is not a minor inefficiency. This is the central mechanism through which fear blocks receiving. Fear delays action. The faithful action that Wattles described as essential to the certain way requires a degree of inner confidence that fear methodically destroys. The step that would cooperate with the channel through which supply is moving cannot be taken by someone whose entire system is vibrating with the anticipation of danger. The action remains theoretical. The decision remains pending. The opportunity moves through its window, while the fearful mind continues to calculate, to assess, to look for the guarantee that would make the action feel safe, and the guarantee never arrives, because the law does not provide guarantees to the fearful mind. It provides channels to the faithful one. Fear distorts opportunity, an opportunity that arrives in an unfamiliar form, at an unexpected moment, through an unexpected person, in an unexpected amount, or requiring an unexpected kind of action, will be processed by the fearful mind as suspect. The filter of fear produces a version of the opportunity that is loaded with threat and emptied of possibility. The same opportunity that an open, trusting mind would receive as a natural expression of the source's provision will appear to the fearful mind as a probable trap, an unreliable promise, or a risk that only a naive person would take. The distortion is not in the opportunity. It is in the receiver. Fear makes small doors look dangerous. One of the most consistent ways in which invisible supply is blocked is through the rejection of what appears to be a small or humble beginning. Supply often does not arrive fully formed. It arrives as a seed, an opening, a small door that requires a faithful step before the next door becomes visible. But fear, which wants certainty and completeness before it will allow movement, looks at the small door and sees only its smallness. It does not see that the small door is the beginning of the corridor. It does not see that faithfulness to the small opening is what reveals the larger one. Fear says, "This is too small to count." Faith says, "This is where we begin." Fear turns silence into abandonment. In the periods between visible supply, in the gaps between one channel closing and the next opening, the fearful mind interprets the silence as evidence that the source has withdrawn. The delay becomes desertion. The pause becomes proof of failure. And in that interpretation, the mind begins to move into the panic behaviors that further close the receiving channel. The frantic searching for alternative plans, the desperate clinging to any visible thread, the compulsive checking of every visible metric for signs of change. These behaviors do not produce supply. They produce more of the very energetic state that is telling the source no more, not yet, I am not able to receive. Fear creates grasping. And grasping, as the masters understood, is the opposite of receiving. Receiving is an act of openness, of allowing what is coming to arrive. Grasping is an act of contraction, of trying to hold what is present so tightly that nothing new can enter. The person in financial fear grasps at current income, terrified of losing it. They grasp at familiar channels, refusing to trust unfamiliar ones. They grasp at certainty, waiting for guarantees that will never come before the step is taken. And in the act of grasping, they close the very hands that supply was moving toward. The source is infinite, but the receiver who is grasping cannot receive. Trust opens perception. This is the reversal. When the inner state shifts from fear to trust, however gradually, however imperfectly, the perceptual field begins to widen. The mind that is not in active threat response mode begins to notice what it was filtering out. The opportunity that was invisible becomes visible. The channel that fear labeled dangerous begins to look like a possibility. The small door that fear dismissed begins to look like an invitation. Trust does not create supply from nothing. It restores the receiver's capacity to perceive and cooperate with the supply that the source is already moving. Trust is not wishful thinking. Trust is the return of perception. Calm allows recognition. There is a quality of inner stillness that the masters described in various ways. A settled, quiet, alert inner state that is neither passive nor anxious, that allows the signals of supply to be recognized as they arrive. Wattles described it in terms of gratitude and faith. Allen described it in terms of right character and aligned thought. Shin described it in terms of right speech and divine order. But they were all pointing at the same inner quality. A calm that is not indifference but confidence. A stillness that is not passivity but readiness. In that state, the receiver recognizes the channel when it opens, because the noise of fear is no longer drowning out the signal. Faith makes action possible, and action is what closes the loop between the invisible supply and the visible result. Without action, the supply has nowhere to land in the visible world. The certain way requires both the inner state of trust and the outer movement of faith-based action. When faith is present, action is no longer waiting for a guarantee. It is moving in the direction of the desired outcome with the confidence that the source is providing through whatever channel is presently open. That action meets the channel. It cooperates with the delivery. It participates in the transformation of invisible supply into visible result. And that participation is what fear had been preventing. Supply reaches open receivers. This is the law stated in its simplest form. Not that the source is partial, not that some people are chosen and others are not that wealth is the reward of virtue and poverty is the punishment of failure. The law is simply this. Supply moves through channels to receivers who are open enough to perceive, trust, and act upon its arrival. The source is not withholding from you. You have been learning to reopen, and everything in this teaching from this moment forward is in service of that reopening. There is a crucial distinction between the kind of planning that faith produces and the kind of planning that fear produces. They look similar from the outside. Both involve thought about the future, Both involve the assessment of options. Both involve decisions about action. But they arise from entirely different inner states. They operate through entirely different mechanisms, and they produce entirely different results. Understanding this distinction is one of the most practically important spiritual insights available to a person who wants to cooperate with the law of invisible supply. The faithful command is simple in its inner form, even when it is complex in its outer content. It says, "The source provides." Not "the source will provide if I am good enough, if I plan thoroughly enough, if I worry adequately about the details." The source provides. The statement is in the present tense because the faithful mind does not place the provision in an uncertain future. It receives the provision as an already operating reality that the visible world has not yet fully reflected. The command goes out from this place of supply, not from the place of panic. And from that inner state, practical plans and actions arise that are shaped by faith rather than contaminated by fear. The fear plan operates from an entirely different premise. It says, "I must prevent disaster." The difference between providing and preventing is the entire difference between a life shaped by faith and a life shaped by fear. The person who is providing acts from supply. The person who is preventing acts from anticipated lack. The person who is providing makes decisions that expand and create. The person who is preventing makes decisions that contract and defend. And while both people may be sitting down to write the same budget or make the same phone call, the inner state behind the behavior is producing fundamentally different creative signals and, in time, fundamentally different results. The fear plan multiplies threats. This is its defining characteristic. When you plan from fear, every scenario you consider becomes an occasion for introducing a new potential threat. You plan for the income and immediately plan for how it might disappear. You plan for the client and immediately plan for how they might leave. You plan for the opportunity and immediately plan for how it might fail. The fearful mind has an extraordinary creative capacity that is almost entirely devoted to the generation of threat elaborations. And the plan that emerges from this process is not a practical guide to faithful action. It is a monument to every possible way that supply might fail to arrive. A faithful plan is calm and useful. It is useful in the same way that a good map is useful. It shows you the terrain without telling you that the destination is unreachable. It identifies what is known, what is possible, what is practical, and what step is nearest and most aligned with the direction of the desired outcome. It does not claim to have solved every possible problem in advance. It does not guarantee every outcome. It simply gives the faithful mind a structure within which to move, an order within which to act, a practical form through which faith can express itself in the visible world. The faithful plan is a tool of action, not a wall of defense. Panic control is not action. This is one of the most important distinctions the viewer needs to hear. There is an enormous amount of activity in the life of the person under financial fear that looks like action, but is actually panic management. Checking accounts obsessively, recalculating the same numbers, looking for new information that does not change the situation. Reaching out to people not because there is something genuine to offer, but because the fear of silence demands some form of movement. This activity consumes extraordinary amounts of energy and time and produces almost nothing in the direction of supply, because it is not arising from a faithful inner state. It is arising from panic. And panic, however busy it makes you, is not the certain way. The difference between planning from supply and planning from panic comes down to the state behind the action. You can make the same phone call from faith or from fear. You can send the same email from trust or from terror. You can take the same step from the inner certainty that the source is providing or from the desperate attempt to force a result before the source can move. And the state behind the action is not merely a private inner experience. It is a creative signal. It shapes the energy with which the action lands. It determines whether the action opens a door or closes one. The masters understood this with absolute clarity. Right action requires right inner state. The viewer who has been extremely busy with financial planning, financial strategy, financial calculation, financial worry disguised as productivity, needs to stop and ask one honest question. Is this activity arising from a place of supply or from a place of panic? Because if the honest answer is panic, then all the activity in the world will not replace the one thing that is actually needed, which is the restoration of the inner state of trust from which faithful, effective, channel-recognizing action can arise. Stop the panic management first. Restore the inner state. Then, act. The action from that state will accomplish in one movement what the panic activity could not accomplish in 100. Practical action is not only allowed, it is required. Wattles never taught passivity. He was not describing a universe in which the receiver sits quietly and waits for money to fall from the sky while doing nothing in the visible world. He was describing a universe in which the inner state of faith produces the perception of channels, and that perception of channels produces faithful action, and that faithful action cooperates with the invisible supply and brings it into visible form. The action is essential, but the action must come from the right source, not from the frantic attempt to force a result, not from the fear-based need to control every variable, from the calm, clear, source-centered certainty that the supply is real and the channel is open. The command versus the plan in its simplest form is this: the command trusts the source and then acts. The plan built from fear trusts the plan and uses the source as a backup. When the plan is the primary trust and the source is the contingency, you are living in the visible world with the invisible world as an emergency resource. When the source is the primary trust and the plan is simply the visible form through which that trust expresses itself in action, you are living in the certain way. The reversal of that priority is not a minor adjustment. It is the foundational shift that changes everything. And it begins not with a new plan. It begins with a new inner state. The person who has read this far and is beginning to feel the distinction between their fear-based planning and the source-centered command is already in the process of shifting. Naming the difference is the beginning of choosing differently. You do not have to discard every practical thought you have. You do not have to stop making budgets or sending proposals or looking for opportunities. You simply have to learn to do those things from the inside of a source-centered trust rather than from the inside of a fear-driven panic. That is the command. Source provides. I act from that. The plan serves the command. The command does not serve the plan. If this teaching is opening something in you that you have not encountered in the shallow presentations of abundance thinking, then what you are experiencing is the depth that the masters actually offered, not the surface version, not the highlights, not the comfortable parts. The Master's Legacy channel exists to preserve and interpret the real teachings of Wallace Wattles, James Allen, Florence Scovel Shinn, and the Masters of the New Thought tradition, not as historical curiosities, but as living laws of mind, source, wealth, and spiritual transformation. If you want to continue receiving this depth, subscribe to the Master's Legacy now, because the teachings go further than any single video can take you. The Masters did not simply teach how to desire wealth. They taught how to become the kind of receiver that wealth can reach. That is a different education entirely, and it requires the kind of sustained, serious, sacred instruction that you will find on this channel, and nowhere that sounds like this. Subscribe. Engage with the teachings. Come back when the fear rises and you need to hear the law again. The channel is here. The Master's teachings are here, and you are clearly someone who is ready to receive them at their full depth. Fear demands proof before trust. This is one of its most consistent and most understandable demands. The mind that has been shaped by ordinary experience, by the visible world's logic of cause and effect, of evidence and action, has learned that proof is the prerequisite for commitment. You see the result, then you act. You receive the guarantee, then you invest. You confirm the safety, then you step. And this logic works reasonably well in the realm of visible world transactions between visible world parties. But it is completely incompatible with the law of invisible supply, because invisible supply does not operate on the visible world sequence. The law operates on the faith world sequence. Trust first, then evidence follows. Fear wants the bridge before the step. This is the precise description of what the fear-governed mind is waiting for when it refuses to act without certainty. It wants the entire pathway, fully constructed, fully visible, fully guaranteed, before it will commit to the first movement. It wants to see the bridge spanning the full distance before it will place its foot on the nearest plank. But the law of invisible supply does not work this way, and could not work this way, because the bridge is not pre-built. The bridge is built by the act of walking. Each step of faithful action reveals the next. Each trusting movement opens the next channel. The complete path cannot be visible from the beginning, because the complete path does not exist until you walk it into existence. Faith takes the step that reveals the bridge. This is not a metaphor for recklessness. It is not an invitation to abandon practical thought or to ignore real-world context. It is a description of a law that operates in the domain of invisible supply. The evidence of the source's provision often appears after the step of trust, not before it. The person who waits for the full view before the first step will wait forever. The person who takes the first clear, faithful step in the direction of the desired outcome will find, consistently with the law, that the next step becomes visible precisely because they took the first one. And then the next. And then the next. The bridge is built from under the feet of the one who is walking in faith. The mind cannot calculate the how, because the how involves dimensions of possibility that the fearful, limited, visible world mind cannot see. The source is not limited to your current visible channels. It is not limited to the income sources you are aware of, the people you have already met, the opportunities you can currently imagine. The formless substance, moving toward a clearly held mental image with faith, can use 10,000 channels that have not yet appeared on your horizon. The mind that is trying to calculate and guarantee and map the entire route before it trusts is a mind that has reduced the infinite source to the size of its own visible world knowledge, and the infinite source cannot work through a receiver who has reduced it to that size. The liberation from the demand for certainty is one of the most profound practical freedoms available to a person working with these laws. When you genuinely release the requirement for proof before trust, when you genuinely accept that the how is the source's domain and not yours, a specific kind of relief arrives that is unlike any other. It is not the relief of having solved the problem. It is the relief of having stopped requiring yourself to solve it. The weight of the impossible calculation, the exhausting effort to figure out how money will come when you cannot see how it will come, lifts. And in the space that opens, the source can begin to reveal the channels that your frantic calculation was covering. The person who has been awake at 3 in the morning trying to calculate the how needs to hear this with the full weight that the masters intended it to carry. You cannot think your way to the provision. You can think your way to the inner state that allows the provision to arrive. Those are not the same thing. The first is fear's work. The second is faith's work. And the distinction between them is the entire difference between the life you have been living and the life that the law makes possible. Stop trying to calculate the route. Start trusting the source. Take the step that is directly in front of you. The bridge will be there when your foot comes down. Imagine that you have prayed for something. You have asked the source sincerely and repeatedly for the provision you need. You have done what you could see to do, and the source, which is not indifferent, which is not withholding, has begun to move supply toward you. Not as a vague concept, as a specific arrival. Something is actually moving in the invisible dimension, through a channel, toward your door. The delivery has been dispatched. The source has not forgotten you. The provision is in motion. And then it arrives. Not with a dramatic announcement, not with trumpets, not in the form you anticipated, but it arrives. It is present. It is at the door. And you bolt the door from the inside. Not because you are cruel, not because you are ungrateful, not because you reject the source's provision in principle, but because fear speaks first. Fear says, what if this is unsafe? Fear says, what if I cannot handle what comes with this? Fear says, what if this is a trick, a mistake, a temporary illusion that will be taken back? And while fear is asking its questions and raising its objections and running its threat assessment, the package sits on the other side of the door. The delivery has arrived, the receiver is not opening. This is not a theoretical possibility. This is the actual spiritual and psychological mechanism by which receiving is blocked in the lives of people who genuinely desire abundance and genuinely believe in the source. They are not dishonest. They are not unspiritual. They are not being punished. They have simply, through years of training in fear, developed an inner reflex that evaluates every arrival through the filter of danger before it evaluates it through the filter of provision. And fear's evaluation is almost always not safe, not certain, not yet. And the supply, which has a delivery window, moves on. Fear has very specific sentences it uses to keep the door bolted, and you will recognize them because you have heard them in your own mind. What if this is unsafe? This is fear questioning the integrity of the channel to avoid the vulnerability of receiving. What if I cannot handle more? This is fear defending the familiar level of suffering against the unfamiliar level of abundance. What if I lose it after I receive it? This is fear projecting the loss into the future as a way of justifying rejection in the present. These sentences sound like wisdom. They sound like due diligence, but they are the specific bolts on the inside of the door. What if I do not deserve this? That is perhaps the most quietly devastating of all the fear sentences, because it strikes at the deepest level of the receiving block. Not the fear of external danger, but the fear of internal unworthiness. The belief that the supply cannot really be for me, that there has been some cosmic error, that if I accept this provision I will be found out as someone who should not have received it. This fear does not lock the door out of self-protection. It locks the door out of self-condemnation. And it is one of the most pervasive receiving errors in the lives of the spiritually sincere. The package waits. This is perhaps the most heartbreaking element of the entire analogy. Supply has been dispatched. The source has moved. The provision is present. And the viewer, who has been told again and again that they are forgotten, abandoned, unprovided for, has spent years believing that the absence of visible delivery confirms the absence of supply. But the supply was not absent. It was waiting for the inner state to shift from contraction to openness, waiting for the fear to be interrupted by one moment of faithful trust, waiting for the door to open. And then the viewer says the source failed. This is the conclusion that fear produces after a long enough standoff between the approaching supply and the bolted door. The viewer prays. The supply moves. The fear bolts the door. The supply waits. The viewer sees no visible result. The viewer concludes that prayer does not work, that the source is not responsive, that the law does not apply to them. And this conclusion, held with the emotional certainty of someone who has been waiting and hoping and continuing not to receive, becomes itself a creative signal that further reinforces the closed state. The lie has become the explanation, and the explanation makes the lie permanent. But the door was locked from the inside. This is the confrontational truth that this teaching is built to deliver. The source was not absent. The supply was not withheld. The provision was moving. The block was not outside. The block was the inner state of fear that sealed the receiver against the arriving good. This is not blame, this is diagnosis. Blame says you are at fault and you should be ashamed. Diagnosis says this is the mechanism that has been operating, and now that you see it, you can change it. The door was locked from the inside, which means you hold the key, which means the opening is in your power, which means the supply has not gone anywhere. It is still there. Trust opens the door. Not a dramatic once-for-all act of heroic faith, not the suppression of every fearful thought, not the performance of certainty you do not feel. Trust, in the practical sense that the Masters intended, is the repeated, deliberate choice to return to source-centered inner state whenever fear attempts to bolt the door again. It is the practice of catching the fear sentence, recognizing it as a bolt, and choosing to set it aside long enough for the door to open. It is the willingness, however imperfect, however accompanied by uncertainty, to receive what the source has already dispatched. That willingness, practiced consistently, is enough. The door opens, the supply arrives. And when the door opens and the supply arrives, it will rarely look exactly as fear said it should not. It will often come in a form that is smaller than pride wanted, or faster than calculation expected, or stranger than the plan anticipated. And the mind that is practicing trust, the mind that is learning to evaluate arrival through faith rather than fear, will recognize that this is exactly how supply moves. Not in tidy, guaranteed, pre-approved packages, in living, dynamic, surprising, source-shaped forms that only the open receiver can recognize and receive. That receiver is who you are becoming, Let us make this concrete. The interference of fear is not an abstract inner event. It has specific recognizable behavioral expressions that the viewer has almost certainly already lived. Consider the client who offered an opportunity that you declined because the terms were unfamiliar or the amount felt too good to be immediately trusted. You told yourself you were being prudent. You told yourself you would wait for something more solid. But the more solid alternative never appeared, and the opportunity that you declined was, in retrospect, a genuine channel through which supply was moving. Fear evaluated it as unsafe. You obeyed fear. The channel closed. Consider the price you should have charged but did not. The amount that reflected the true value of your work, your time, your service. The amount that the client may well have been prepared to pay. But fear spoke before you could speak, and fear said, "That is too much, they will reject you. They will think you are greedy. They will find someone else." So you charged less. You accepted less than the provision that was available to you because fear calculated the risk of asking and decided the risk was too high. This is not caution. This is a specific, measurable interference with your financial supply, performed by fear in the name of self-protection. Consider the work you have not published, the project you have not completed, the service you have not offered, the business you have not started. Somewhere in your life there is something you have created or could create that the world would receive and exchange for supply. And fear has kept it internal, unfinished, unpresented, protected from the exposure that publishing requires. Fear said, "What if no one values it? What if it is criticized? What if I fail publicly?" And in response to those questions, you kept the creation behind the door, private and safe and completely unable to fulfill its function as a channel for your supply. Consider the conversation you did not have, the help you did not ask for, the partnership you did not pursue, the question you did not ask because asking felt like admission of inadequacy or exposure to refusal. There are people in your life and in your professional world who may have been positioned to open a channel of supply for you, or to introduce you to someone who could, or to offer an opportunity that would have changed the direction of your finances. But fear prevented the conversation. Fear said the asking was too exposed, too presumptuous, too vulnerable. And the channel that those conversations might have opened never opened because the initial word was never spoken. Consider the opportunity you dismissed because you did not trust its source. A new person entered your life with an offer or an idea or an invitation, and fear immediately produced reasons to be suspicious. The offer seemed too easy. The person seemed too unexpected. The situation did not fit your established pattern of how supply arrives, and you declined or you delayed or you withdrew from engagement until the window closed. The supply was present. The channel was open. The receiver said no because the delivery service did not match the pre-approved template that fear had constructed for acceptable supply. Consider the moment you hoarded in panic, the sum of money that arrived at a time of financial uncertainty, and instead of flowing it in a direction that might have opened further channels, you locked it down in an act of fearful hoarding. There is a practical wisdom in saving, but there is a fearful hoarding in locking resources away from every possible function except the management of terror. The hoarded resource serves fear. It does not serve the certain way. It says, "I do not trust the source to provide again, so I must preserve this until it runs out and then I will face the disaster I have been anticipating." Hoarding is not abundance consciousness. Hoarding is the financial behavior of someone who believes the source has given its last. Consider the help you refused, not because the help was genuinely inappropriate or came from a genuinely untrustworthy source, but because receiving help felt like vulnerability, like debt, like the admission that you could not manage alone, like an exposure of your limitation that would give someone else power over you. And so you refused what was offered and returned to the isolation of managing alone from fear. The help was a channel, it was dispatched. You rejected delivery. And the person who offered it did not offer again because refusal communicates a message that good people tend to honor. Consider every new door you labeled risky simply because it was new, not because it had any objective feature that warranted greater skepticism than familiar doors, but because its newness meant it had not yet been approved by fear's threat assessment process which requires a lengthy period of surveillance before any new channel is deemed acceptable. And in that period of surveillance, the window closed. The new channel moved on to receivers who were more willing to investigate than to immediately suspect. And you remained with the familiar channels that fear had already assessed and approved, which is to say the channels that had already proven themselves to be insufficient. There is a specific kind of exhaustion that belongs to the person who has been tracking the package obsessively. You know the feeling. You have sent the prayer. You have done the practice. You have declared the abundance, and then you began to watch for evidence every day, every hour in some cases, looking for signs that the supply is moving, looking for confirmation that the source has received the order, analyzing every small development for its significance as a signal of approaching delivery. And the watching is wearing you out, not because the watching is wrong in its motivation, but because the watching is anxiety in spiritual clothing, and anxiety is not a receiving state. The masters understood, each in their own language, that the inner state required for supply to arrive is not the vigilant tracking of an obsessive watcher. It is the settled confidence of a person who has placed their order, knows the order has been received, and is going about the faithful business of living while the delivery is processed. Wattles was precise about this. You must think no more about lack. Not, you must monitor lack constantly to ensure it does not expand. You must think no more about it. The order has been placed. The source is filling it. Your job is to hold the image, maintain the faith, take the faithful action that is before you, and allow the delivery to arrive without strangling it with surveillance. Fear may knock, but it does not own the house. This is the inner authority statement that the viewer needs to develop the daily practice of making. Fear will not stop knocking. You will not reach a stage in your spiritual development at which fear ceases to present itself and offer its assessments of incoming supply. But there is a profound difference between a house in which fear knocks and is heard, but not obeyed, and a house in which fear has been given the keys and governs every room. The practice is not the elimination of fear, it is the maintenance of authority. Fear may knock. It may even enter as a visitor, but it does not set the agenda. It does not govern the decisions. It does not bolt the door. You can feel fear and still open the door. This is perhaps the most practically liberating statement in this entire teaching, because the viewer who has been waiting until they feel fearless before they can receive has been waiting for a condition that may never perfectly arrive. The condition for receiving is not the absence of fear. The condition for receiving is the willingness to open the door regardless of whether fear is present. You can have the fearful thought and choose the faithful action. You can feel the nervous tightening in the chest and still send the proposal. Make the offer. Accept the help. Say yes to the door. The fear does not have to disappear for the action to be taken. The action only requires a faithful choice made in the presence of fear, in spite of fear, through fear if necessary. The source does not require a fearless body, it requires a faithful choice. This is the law without romanticism, without the pretense that spiritual maturity means the body never responds with fear. The body is designed to signal potential danger. The body will continue to signal potential danger when unfamiliar channels open. What the source requires is not that you suppress the body's signal, but that you do not confuse the body's signal with the law's verdict. The signal says, "This is new, this is unknown, proceed with awareness." The faithful choice says, "I am aware, I am here, I am open. The source is providing, I receive this delivery with gratitude." That choice made consistently in the presence of fear is the practice that transforms the receiver. The freedom of not tracking the package is the freedom of the person who has genuinely transferred the how to the source. They are not indifferent to supply. They desire it. They welcome it. They are actively participating in the faithful actions that cooperate with it. But they have stopped requiring themselves to monitor every variable between their desire and its arrival. They have stopped standing at the window watching for the delivery vehicle. They have returned to the faithful occupation of their life, trusting that the package will arrive and that when it does, they will recognize it and open the door. That freedom is not passivity. It is the deepest form of trust. It is what faith looks like when it has matured into practice. The person who gives themselves permission to stop tracking does not become careless about their finances or their responsibilities. They become clear. They become able to see what is actually before them rather than being buried in the surveillance of what has not yet arrived. They become responsive to the channels that are actually open rather than fixated on the channels that have closed. They become available to the supply that the source is moving in ways they did not predict rather than waiting for the supply they calculated. And in that availability, in that clear-eyed, trust-grounded, faithful openness, they become the kind of receiver that supply actually reaches. There is a peace on the other side of releasing the tracking. It is not the peace of having solved the financial problem. It is the peace of having stopped requiring yourself to solve it alone. It is the peace of the person who genuinely knows, not as a comforting thought but as a practical operative certainty, that the source is infinite, that the supply is already moving, that the channels will open at the right moment, and that all that is asked of them is the faithful choice to keep the door unlocked. That peace is available to you right now, not after the supply arrives, right now, because the peace is not produced by the arrival. The peace is what makes the arrival possible. Before anything else can shift, before the fear can be interrupted and the supply can be received, there must be clarity about what you actually want. Not the safe, minimized, fear-approved version of what you want. Not the amount you think you deserve or the level of prosperity you think is realistic for someone in your position, but the genuine financial condition you desire. Wattles was insistent on this clarity as the foundation of the entire creative process. You cannot direct the formless substance toward a vague, apologetic, self-editing desire. You must know what you want, clearly and specifically, and you must be willing to hold that image in your mind without shame, without apology, and without the constant interruption of fear's verdict on your worthiness. Ask yourself honestly, what financial condition do you desire? Not what you think is possible given your current visible circumstances. Not what your history suggests you should expect. What do you genuinely desire? What income? What freedom? What provision? What resource would constitute the financial peace you have been seeking? This is not an invitation to fantasy. It is an invitation to honest desire. Wattles taught that the desire for increase is a legitimate and creative impulse of the source expressing through the human person. It is not greed. It is not spiritually suspect. It is the natural movement of life toward greater expression, and it is the seed of the creative process. What would peace feel like in your financial life? Let that question sit for a moment. Not the peace of having everything solved and secured against every possible future danger, but the peace of knowing that the supply is real, that the source is providing, that the channels are open and more are opening, that your needs will be met and your desires are legitimate and the formless substance is responsive to your faith. What would that peace feel like in the body, in the chest, in the quality of the morning when you wake, in the absence of the 3 in the morning calculation? Let yourself feel the honest answer, because that feeling is itself a creative signal. It is the mental image of the desired condition experienced as already present. What would you do if fear were not governing your decisions? This is one of the most revealing questions you can ask yourself, because the life that fear has been preventing is not completely invisible to you. You know what you would pursue if the fear were gone. You know what offer you would make, what price you would charge, what proposal you would send, what door you would knock on, what help you would accept. Fear has not made you ignorant of the possibilities. It has made you unable to act on them. So begin here. List, privately and honestly, the actions you would take if fear were not voting. That list is your faith agenda. That list is what the certain way looks like for your specific life. What amount or opportunity are you currently avoiding because fear has labeled it as too much, too soon, too risky, or too uncertain? There is almost certainly something in your present financial landscape that is closer to delivery than you have allowed yourself to believe. But that fear has been keeping you from fully engaging with. An offer that has been waiting for your commitment. A client who has been waiting for your confidence. An income stream that has been waiting for your courage. A sum that has been waiting for your permission to receive it. The fear has not eliminated these possibilities. It has surrounded them with enough threat language to keep you at a distance. Name what you are avoiding. What door are you afraid of because it expands you? This is the question that addresses the fear of increase itself, the specific terror of becoming more than you have been. Because for many spiritually sincere people, the fear is not only the fear that supply will not come, it is also the fear that supply will come and change them, change their relationships, change others' perceptions of them, change their responsibilities and their visibility and their exposure to judgment. This fear is particularly powerful because it appears to be about protecting others, about not becoming arrogant, about staying connected to community. But it is still a bolt on the door. Name the door that expands you, acknowledge the fear around it, and hold the image of walking through it in faith. The practice of defining the what is not a one-time event. It is a daily practice of returning to clarity in the presence of the fear that constantly tries to blur, minimize, and apologize for your desires. Every morning, or as often as you are able, bring the image back into focus. What is the financial condition you desire? What does it look and feel like? What would you be doing? How would you be living? What quality of inner state would you be carrying if that condition were your present reality? Hold that image, not as a desperate wish, not as an anxious prayer, but as the clear, faith-grounded mental signal that you are directing at the formless substance and that the formless substance is receiving and beginning to fill. Gratitude is the bridge between the clarity of what you desire and the reality of what you already have. Wattles was explicit about this. Begin with gratitude for what is present before you extend desire toward what is not yet visible. This is not denial of what is lacking. It is the practice of keeping the attention anchored in supply already received, which keeps the mind in the creative state of abundance rather than the destructive state of lack. The person who can genuinely feel gratitude for the supply that is already present, however small, however insufficient for all their needs, is a person whose attention is moving in the direction of more. Gratitude says to the source, I have recognized what you have already given, and in that recognition I remain open to receive further. The what must be stated with the inner authority of a person who knows they are in relationship with the source of all supply, not the hesitant half-desire of someone who is not sure they are allowed to want this, not the apology disguised as a prayer, the clear, direct, faith-grounded inner statement of a person exercising their legitimate creative relationship with the formless substance. I desire this. I hold this image clearly. I maintain this faith consistently. I am ready to receive through whatever channel the source chooses. This is not arrogance, this is cooperation with the law. And the law requires this kind of clarity and confidence from the receiver if it is to work at its full capacity. The defining of the what is an act of courage. It requires you to stop minimizing your desires to make them safe from disappointment. It requires you to stop apologizing for wanting abundance. It requires you to hold an image larger than your current visible circumstances without immediately allowing fear to remind you of every reason why that image is unrealistic. It requires the specific kind of spiritual courage that Wattles called faith, the steady, clear, persistent holding of the desired condition as a real creative intention directed at the responsive, formless substance. You are capable of this. The source does not require perfection before it provides. It requires clarity. Provide the clarity. The source will do the rest. You have defined the what. Now comes the practice that fear resists most violently, the release of the how. Because fear does not object to the desire. Fear will sometimes allow the desire to be held, as long as it is allowed to control the question of how the desire will be fulfilled. And the control of the how is where fear does its most effective work, because the how is where every unknown lives, and every unknown is where fear has the greatest power. The release of the how is not passive surrender. It is the active, deliberate, practiced act of returning the method of provision to the source and refusing to make the supply conditional on your ability to calculate its delivery route. Begin by naming the fear, not in general, specifically. The fear that is present right now in relation to your financial desire. Not, I have fear about money in the abstract sense that allows the fear to remain formless and therefore unaddressable. Give it a specific sentence. I am afraid that the income I need will not appear before the rent is due. I am afraid that no one will pay what I need to charge. I am afraid that the opportunity that looks promising is actually unreliable. Give the fear a precise sentence, because precision is the beginning of authority. You cannot interrupt a fear you refuse to name. Then say, with whatever degree of sincerity you can access in this moment, this fear is not my source, not as a performance, not as a mechanical repetition of a phrase that you hope will change something without engaging you, but as an actual inner statement of correction. This fear is not my source. The fear is present. The fear has a sentence. The fear feels real. And none of that makes it the source of your supply. The fear is a signal. The source is the supply. They are not the same thing. And in this moment, you are distinguishing between them and returning your trust to the one that is actually providing. Separate the warning from the command. This is the precise practical skill that the release of the how requires. If the fear is alerting you to something that requires practical attention, give that attention honestly. If you genuinely need to make a phone call, send a payment, update a plan, have a difficult conversation, or correct a real practical error, do that. The warning has served its function. Thank it for the useful information and act on what is practically actionable, but then stop. Do not allow the warning to become a command. Do not allow the signal to become a governance. The bell rang. You heard it. You addressed what needed addressing. The bell can stop now. The source is in charge of the rest. Ask yourself, in the specific moment of fear, what would faith do next? Not what would a fearless person do, because you are not pretending to be fearless. What would a faithful person, someone who is genuinely afraid and genuinely trusting the source simultaneously, do next? The answer to that question, in almost every financial situation, will be simpler and more direct than the elaborate fear-driven calculations that are competing for your attention. It will usually involve one clear action: make the call, send the message, accept the offer, look at the account honestly, ask the question, say yes to the door that is open. One faithful action, not the entire solution. The next step: take one action without total guarantee. This is the practice that builds the faith, that builds the trust, that opens the receiver. Not a reckless leap, not an unexamined commitment to an obviously dangerous situation. One faithful action in the direction of the desired outcome, taken in the absence of total certainty, with the inner statement of trust that the source is providing through this channel. Send the proposal without knowing it will be accepted. Make the offer without knowing it will be received. Ask the question without knowing the answer will be yes. Say yes to the door without knowing what the next room looks like. Each of these actions is a vote for the source over the fear. And the accumulation of those votes is the practice of the certain way. The release of the how is not an event, it is a practice. And like all practices, it will be imperfect at first. You will release the how and then find yourself calculating it again 20 minutes later. You will make the faithful action and then immediately begin to monitor the result for signs of failure. This is not evidence that you have failed at the practice. This is the practice. Release, return to fear, release again. Notice the fear, name it, separate it from the source, release the how again. The practice is not the one-time release. The practice is the repeated return to source-centered trust every time fear reclaims the center of your inner life. And every return, however imperfect, is a movement in the right direction. The reason fear fights the release of the how with such force is that the how is where fear believes its value lies. Fear has convinced the mind that its elaborate planning and calculation and scenario mapping and worst-case preparation is what is keeping the system from collapsing. If the how is released to the source, fear loses its primary justification for its presence in the inner life. It can no longer claim to be the indispensable strategic intelligence keeping you safe. And so when you begin to practice the release of the how, fear will intensify. It will produce more elaborate calculations. It will present more urgent scenarios. It will raise the volume of its warnings. This is not evidence that the release is dangerous. It is evidence that the release is working. The practical experience of releasing the how, for people who actually practice it consistently, is not the experience of recklessness or naive optimism. It is the experience of extraordinary clarity. When you stop requiring yourself to know the entire route before you trust the source, When you genuinely give the how back to the infinite intelligence that can see 10,000 channels where you can see 2, you find that your attention clarifies around the nearest faithful action rather than scattering across the infinite map of possible threats and contingencies. The mind that is not calculating the how is free to perceive the what is right in front of it. And what is right in front of it is almost always an open door. The spiritual truth beneath the practice of releasing the how is this: you were never meant to carry that weight. The how was never your domain. The what is yours, to define clearly, to hold faithfully, to desire without apology. The source's domain is the how, the route, the channel, the timing, the form of delivery, the specific circumstances through which the invisible supply becomes visible provision. This is not a division of labor that disadvantages you. It is a division of labor that releases you. The source is infinitely better equipped to manage the how than your fear-governed, visibility-limited, calculation-exhausted mind. Give it back. Hold the what in faith. Walk through the nearest door. And let the source be the source. One of the most precise ways to identify whether you are operating from faith or from fear is to examine your relationship with surprise. Fear hates surprise because surprise is, by definition, something that was not calculated, predicted, controlled, or pre-approved by the threat assessment process. Surprise means the system worked in a way that the fearful mind did not manage. And that is exactly what should be expected from an infinite source providing through 10,000 channels, only a small number of which are visible to any individual mind. Invisible supply almost always arrives in forms that surprise the receiver. This is not a design flaw. It is a feature of how infinite provision works. Train yourself to receive a new person with openness rather than immediate assessment. Invisible supply moves through people. People carry introductions, opportunities, ideas, partnerships, and direct provision. And the person through whom supply moves is very often not the person you would have predicted or selected. They may come from an unexpected social context, an unexpected professional background, an unexpected set of circumstances. They may seem unlikely on the surface. Fear immediately evaluates. Can I trust this? Do they fit my template? Are they what I was expecting? But the question faith asks is simpler and more generative. What is the source doing through this connection? Train yourself to receive an unexpected offer without immediately deflecting. Offers arrive. They arrive as business proposals, as gifts, as collaborations, as invitations, as ideas from other people, as services extended without obvious return. Fear's first response to an offer is usually suspicion or deflection. What is required of me in return? Why is this person being generous? What is the risk in accepting? What will I owe? But faith's response to an offer is simpler. This may be a channel. Receive it with gratitude. Investigate it with clarity. Accept it if it is genuine and appropriate. The source often moves through generosity, and the refusal of generosity is the refusal of the channel. When a strange idea arises, let it complete its sentence before fear cuts it off. There are people who have dismissed creative, financial, or practical ideas at the very moment of their arising because the ideas were unfamiliar, unexpected, or too far outside the established template of how things are done in their domain. Fear says, that is not how it works. That is not appropriate. That is not what people like you do. But ideas are among the most primary channels through which invisible supply moves into the visible world. An idea that arrives with a quality of clarity and creative energy may be the source's method of directing you toward the channel through which your next provision is moving. Do not dismiss the strange idea. Sit with it. Explore it. Ask whether it is a door. Even a small opportunity deserves the evaluation of faith, not just the dismissal of fear. The viewer who is waiting for the large, certain, pre-approved delivery will consistently dismiss the small and strange. But Wattles taught that the faithful action on the nearest available opportunity is what opens the next door. The small channel faithfully engaged is what reveals the larger channel. If you dismiss every small opportunity as beneath your expectation, you are not waiting faithfully for a larger one. You are refusing the law's method of sequential unfolding in favor of your fear's demand for complete delivery before commitment. A closed door is a redirection, not a denial. When a channel closes, when an expected opportunity does not materialize, when a plan fails to produce its anticipated result, fear immediately interprets the closure as evidence of abandonment or unworthiness. But the law understands closed doors differently. A closed door redirects attention and energy toward an open one. The closing of a channel that was no longer aligned with the direction of your supply is not the source withdrawing. It is the source guiding. The redirection may be uncomfortable. It may require adjustment and re-evaluation, but it is not abandonment. It is navigation. And the faith that recognizes this will not be paralyzed by closed doors. A delayed answer is not a denied answer. Some of the most significant provision in any life arrives later than the receiver expected, through channels they did not anticipate, in amounts that were different from what they requested. The delay is not always evidence of failure in the practice. Sometimes the delay is the source preparing the channel, aligning the conditions, or preparing the receiver. The person who has been practicing trust long enough will recognize, looking back over the arc of their financial experience, that the most meaningful provisions often came at the moment they stopped demanding the specific timing and opened to the source's timing. That recognition is itself a practice that builds the trust that welcomes surprise. A humble beginning is not a failed promise. When the first arrival of supply is smaller than the prayer requested, fear says the law failed. But faith says, this is how the unfolding begins. The seed does not arrive as the forest. The first delivery does not arrive as the complete provision. The humble beginning is the faithful beginning, the faithful cooperation with the law that produces the next stage of increase. Wallace Wattles was not describing a law of instant provision. He was describing a law of certain provision, provision that arrives surely and increasingly when the receiver maintains the inner state and the faithful action consistently over time. The humble beginning is the beginning. Honor it. The final element of the practical protocol is also the most immediately actionable. Walk through the nearest door, not the perfect door, not the guaranteed door, not the door that fear has already pre-approved as safe and familiar. The nearest door, the one that is presently open, that is aligned with the direction of your desired outcome, that requires a faithful step rather than a guaranteed certainty. Walk through it. Because the law does not unfold through waiting. It unfolds through faithful movement. Send the message while you are nervous. Do not wait until the nervousness resolves into confidence, because that resolution may not arrive before the window closes. The message that needs to be sent, the inquiry that needs to be made, the proposal that needs to go out, these things have windows. And the nervous person who sends the message through the nervousness, who does not wait for the fear to grant permission before acting, is operating in the certain way. The nervousness does not indicate that the action is wrong. It often indicates that the action is important, that it is at the frontier of the familiar, which is precisely where supply tends to be opening. Make the offer while uncertain. There is an offer in your life right now, a service, a collaboration, a product, a creative work, a practical contribution, something that you have been preparing to offer but have not yet offered because the uncertainty has been too large, the timing has felt wrong, the fear has found reasons to delay. Make the offer now, not because the uncertainty has been resolved, because the offering is the action of faith, and the action of faith is what the law is waiting for. You do not know how it will be received. You cannot know. The source knows. The source is already moving in the direction of that offering's reception. Your job is to make the offering. The source's job is to prepare the receiver. Accept support while uncomfortable. If someone is offering you help, accept it, even if accepting makes you feel exposed or indebted or uncomfortably seen. The discomfort of receiving is not evidence that the support is inappropriate or that receiving is wrong. It is evidence that your receiving reflex has been contracted by fear and requires practice to reopen. Every time you accept support with gratitude, rather than deflecting it with pride or fear, you are practicing the open receiver state that supply needs in order to arrive. The support is a channel. It is dispatched. Accepting it with dignity and gratitude, even through the discomfort, is the practice of the open door. Look at your finances honestly. There is a specific form of avoidance that the fearful mind employs with financial information, the decision not to look. The unopened statements, the unevaluated accounts, the unexamined budget, the unmade financial plan, these are all expressions of the same fear that closes the door against incoming supply. Because you cannot cooperate with what you cannot clearly see. You cannot act in the certain way with information you are refusing to examine. Wattles did not describe the certain way as a process of spiritual bypassing in which the details of the visible world are ignored. He described a way of engaging the visible world from the inner state of faith, which requires honest engagement with the reality of your present situation. Stop hiding. This is perhaps the most direct instruction in the entire practical protocol. Stop hiding the work, the offering, the service, the desire, the need, the self. Hiding is fear's strategy for avoiding the exposure that supply requires. Supply moves through channels, and channels require presence. They require that you be findable, visible, reachable, and identifiable as someone who has something to offer and is open to receiving. The person who is hiding, whose work is invisible, whose offering is not presented, whose desire is not expressed, whose need is not stated, has removed themselves from the path of the channels through which supply would move. Come out of hiding. The supply needs to be able to find you. Start small. The instruction to walk through the nearest door is not an instruction to leap through the largest available opening in a single act of dramatic faith. It is an instruction to take the nearest small faithful action, the one that is practically available to you today, in the direction of your desired outcome. Small faithful actions, consistently taken, build the receiving capacity, the faith, the perception of channels, and the creative momentum that larger provision requires. Do not despise the small beginning. Do not wait for the large beginning. Start with what is nearest, what is available, what is practically before you right now. That is the certain way. That is where the law begins to move. Now we arrive at the naming of the fear we have been building toward. The respectable fear. The fear that spiritual people defend because it has been dressed in the language of wisdom, realism, and responsibility. It is the fear that says, I am simply being realistic, and believes this statement makes the fear legitimate and the contraction intelligent. But realism is only wisdom when what you are accepting as real is the fullest picture of reality, including the invisible supply, the source behind every visible resource, and the law of formless substance that Wattles described as operating beneath every visible condition. To call contraction around lack realism, while ignoring the invisible supply that underlies it, is not realism. It is selective vision, curated by fear and called by a more dignified name. I should not want too much. This is the sentence that generations of spiritually sincere people have used to stop themselves at the threshold of legitimate desire. It sounds humble. It sounds like the mark of a person who knows their place and does not mistake themselves for someone whose needs should take up too much of the universe's attention. But Wattles was very clear. The desire for increase is not too much. It is the legitimate creative movement of life toward greater expression. The universe does not resent your desire for more. The universe does not reward smallness. The universe is an infinitely abundant creative medium that responds to clear, faith-grounded desire with the movement of supply. Limiting your desire to avoid appearing greedy or presumptuous is not spiritual virtue. It is a form of false safety that keeps the supply at bay. I cannot risk being seen. This sentence is carrying an enormous amount of fear inside a very small container, because visibility is the condition for most forms of supply to arrive. The work must be seen to be valued. The service must be known to be purchased. The offering must be presented to be received. The person must be findable for the channel to open. When fear says you cannot risk being seen, it is protecting you against the exposure of judgment, criticism, and the possible rejection that visibility invites. And the cost of that protection is near total supply restriction. You cannot receive for work that is invisible. You cannot create channels for provision that does not know you exist. Visibility is not vanity. In the context of the law, it is a practical necessity. I cannot ask. Already named in this teaching, but worth naming again here in its identity as false safety, because the conviction that asking is too risky has created profound long-term financial deprivation in the lives of spiritually sincere people who are otherwise doing almost everything else correctly. They are holding the image, they are maintaining the faith, they are waiting for the source to provide, and they are refusing the one simple, practical, necessary action that would open the specific channel through which the provision is moving. The ask, the direct, honest, vulnerable, specifically worded request that states what is needed and invites the response of the person who has the capacity to provide it. That single act of asking, repeated consistently, would change the financial trajectory of most people's lives within weeks. And fear has made it feel impossible. I better hold on to this dead situation. This is the safety trap in its most clearly named form. The choice to remain in a financial situation, a job, a relationship, an arrangement, a contract, a circumstance that has clearly stopped serving the direction of your desired outcome. Because the known suffering of the present situation is less terrifying than the unknown possibility of change. The familiar insufficiency feels safer than the unfamiliar possibility. And so people remain in arrangements that are actively limiting their supply because fear has convinced them that what is known, however insufficient, is preferable to what is not yet known, however potentially abundant. The dead situation is not safety. It is a closed channel that you have decided to call home. At least this is familiar. Familiarity is not wisdom. Familiarity is comfort. And comfort is not the same as supply. The formless substance does not send provision through the channels that are most familiar to you by preference. It sends provision through whatever channels are presently open, including channels that are entirely unfamiliar, strange, unexpected, and uncomfortable. The person who has made familiarity a prerequisite for receiving has disqualified most of the channels through which the source might move. The channel that feels familiar has almost certainly already produced what it is capable of producing. The unfamiliar channel is where new supply is moving, and fear has made unfamiliar into dangerous, which is one of the most expensive false equations in the spiritual prosperity vocabulary. What if increase changes me? This is the fear of the self that supply will create, the concern that prosperity will alter who you are in ways that are spiritually, relationally, or personally costly. What if more money changes my relationships? What if abundance makes me arrogant? What if prosperity separates me from the community I love? These are not entirely unreasonable questions in isolation, but as a justification for refusing to receive, they are fear using the language of spiritual concern to maintain the status quo of limitation. The source is not trying to corrupt you through increase. The source is trying to express more life through you. The character you have developed is not destroyed by supply. It is the character that determines how supply is used. What if I fail publicly? This is the fear that puts the potential judgment of observers ahead of the direction of the source. Public failure is genuinely uncomfortable. Being seen to have tried and not succeeded, in a culture that has very specific opinions about the meaning of visible failure, is a real human experience that has real emotional weight. But the alternative to risking public failure is private stagnation, the life lived entirely within the perimeter of what fear has approved as safe enough to attempt publicly. That perimeter, as we have already established, contracts every year it is obeyed. The question is not whether public failure is painful. It is whether the fear of public failure should have more authority over your life than the source's law of supply. It should not. It does not. But you must say so. The supply arrived. It was not received. This is the essential story of the person whose financial life is being governed by fear in the respectable costume described in the previous section. And the rejection takes specific, recognizable forms that the viewer needs to be able to identify when they occur so that the pattern can be interrupted. The first form is the dismissal of the opportunity that seems too small. When supply arrives in a small form, when the opportunity is modest in its initial offering, when the provision appears to be a seed rather than a harvest, the pride that fear has cultivated decides that this delivery is beneath the expected standard. And the small opportunity, which was the beginning of the unfolding, is rejected. The harvest is refused because it arrived as a seed. The person seems too unexpected. Supply, as we have established, moves through people, and the person through whom supply is moving toward you will very often be someone you would not have selected from a list of approved supply deliverers. They may be younger than you expected, or older. They may come from a domain you associate with something other than financial supply. They may have a history, a style, a manner of presentation, or a social context that does not match your template for legitimate channels. Fear evaluates the person and finds them insufficiently credentialed. And in that evaluation, fear has rejected the delivery based not on the actual quality of the provision, but on the appearance of the delivery person. The offer seems too fast. Supply sometimes moves quickly. An opportunity that appears and requires a relatively prompt decision is not automatically suspicious. The law of invisible supply does not operate on a schedule that always allows the fearful mind its preferred period of extended surveillance. Sometimes a door opens quickly and closes quickly, and the person who waits for the fear to complete its threat assessment will find, when the assessment is finally complete, that the door has already closed. Speed is not inherently dangerous. Fear has made speed a category of risk because speed means the decision must be made before full certainty is available. But full certainty is never available in the domain of invisible supply. Faith is what acts before certainty, and faith sometimes acts fast. The door seems too new, a genuinely new channel of supply, a form of provision that has no precedent in the viewer's financial history, will be evaluated by fear as inherently more risky than familiar channels simply by virtue of its novelty. The person who has always received supply in one form will find that when supply begins to move through an entirely new form, every part of the fear-governed system will resist the unfamiliar delivery. Not because the new channel is actually more dangerous, but because the threat assessment process requires historical data to produce its assessment, and a new channel provides none. This means that the person living under fear is systematically disadvantaged in their ability to receive supply through channels that the source has opened recently, which is exactly where the most significant new provision often moves. The idea seems too simple. Wisdom in the fear-governed mind has a complexity requirement. Sophisticated people do not pursue simple ideas. Credible solutions do not arrive without elaborate mechanisms. And so when the source moves supply through a clear, direct, simple idea or opportunity, the fear-governed mind applies its complexity filter and decides that anything this simple cannot be trusted, cannot be the real solution, cannot be the actual channel. But simplicity is not naivety. Some of the most powerful channels through which supply has ever moved in human lives were simple, direct, uncomplicated in their essential logic, even if complex in their execution. Do not disqualify simple delivery. Help feels uncomfortable. The offering of support, assistance, connection, or resource by another person is one of the primary channels through which invisible supply moves in the visible world. And for the person under fear, the reception of help is loaded with threat. It threatens independence, invites perceived indebtedness, creates vulnerability to judgment, and requires the admission of need that fear has associated with weakness or failure. So help is declined, deflected, minimized, redirected. And each act of deflection is a rejection of a channel that the source was using. Help is not charity, it is the law. It is the mechanism through which the formless substance distributes provision through the network of human connection. Receive it. Visibility feels unsafe. Many people with genuine financial gifts, genuine offerings, genuine value to provide to the world, are living in a state of financial insufficiency, not because their offering is inadequate, but because their fear of visibility has kept them from presenting the offering in any place where supply can find it. They have created the gift and hidden it. They have developed the service and kept it private. They have prepared the offering and decided not to present it because the visibility required for the presentation feels, to the fear-governed self, like standing in an open field during a storm. The vulnerability of being seen is too much, and the supply that would flow through that visibility never arrives because the offering never became findable. Receiving feels undeserved. This may be the most important rejected delivery of all, because it operates at the deepest level of the identity. The belief that what the source is offering is not actually meant for you, that there has been some error, that you have not done enough to earn this provision, that you are not the kind of person this level of supply was intended for. This is not humility. This is a specific receiving block that has been installed by years of comparison, shame, unworthiness conditioning, and the spiritual confusion between earned status and unconditional supply. Wattles never described the formless substance as a system of earned provision. He described it as a responsive creative medium that moves toward clear, faith-grounded desire from any receiver who is open to it. Openness, not worthiness, is the qualification. There are sentences that fear uses as inner commands, and the viewer needs to be able to recognize them precisely because they are not simply passive observations. They are active, creative signals. When the mind repeats, "I am not safe," it is not simply noting a concern. It is directing the creative intelligence toward the production of an experience that matches the signal of danger. When the thought "there is never enough" runs as a steady background frequency through the financial mind, it is not observing a temporary condition. It is impressing a permanent orientation toward insufficiency upon the formless substance that is responsive to exactly this kind of persistent, emotionally charged mental signal. This will fail. I cannot trust this. These two sentences, repeated in the context of incoming opportunities, incoming offers, incoming supply of any kind, function as a rejection mechanism that operates entirely beneath the level of conscious evaluation. The person saying "this will fail" has not evaluated the specific situation. They have applied a default expectation of failure to every incoming possibility before investigation begins. This is not discernment. It is a fear template being applied wholesale to every potential channel. And every application of the template to a genuine channel is a rejection of that channel before it has been genuinely assessed. The channel closes. Fear calls the closing confirmation of its prediction. I always lose money. Nothing good lasts. These sentences are among the most damaging that a person can maintain as inner frequency because they do not merely predict future loss. They retroactively construct a story of inevitable loss that then functions as the evidence base for the prediction. The mind that holds "I always lose money" will interpret every financial setback as confirmation, regardless of cause or context, and will interpret every financial gain as temporary, as the beginning of the next loss, as evidence that what is given will be taken back. This interpretation pattern ensures that even when supply arrives, the receiver cannot rest in it, cannot build from it, cannot allow it to be the beginning of the next stage of increase. The story of inevitable loss turns every gain into a temporary loan. These sentences become inner commands if they are repeated with emotional investment. Florence Scovel Shinn taught with great precision about the power of the spoken and unspoken word as a directive force in the life of the speaker. The words you say and the words you repeat internally are orders. They are not neutral observations. They are instructions to the creative intelligence about what to produce. The person who wakes every morning and rehearses the fear sentences, even silently, even in the privacy of their own mind's first thoughts, is giving orders. They are exercising their creative power in the direction of the unwanted. And the law, which does not judge the direction of the order, simply fills it. What is required is not the elimination of the thought. Thoughts arise without the full consent of the conscious will. What is required is the interruption of the thought before it is repeated with emotional investment into the status of a governing inner command. You can observe "I am not safe" as a passing fear signal without co-signing it. You can hear "there is never enough" as a fear sentence without granting it the status of spiritual law. You can notice "this will fail" as fear's prediction without converting it into faith's expectation. The interruption, consistently practiced, is what changes the inner frequency. Not by suppressing the signal, but by refusing to amplify it with repeated emotional attention. The replacement is not a slogan. It is a return. When the fear signal arises, the practice is to return to the source. Not to chant a phrase over the top of the fear like a louder signal trying to drown a quieter one, but to genuinely redirect the inner attention to the source as the actual provider. To say with the full weight of spiritual understanding, this fear is not the source. The source is infinite. The supply is present. I return to trust. That return is a choice. It may feel small and insufficient in the face of powerful fear, but it is the choice that the law honors. It is the choice that reopens the receiver. And every time you make it, you are practicing the faith that makes you able to receive. Hear the fear. Do not attempt to not hear it. Do not suppress it, rush past it, or perform a spiritual composure that denies its presence. Let the fear be heard. Give it enough genuine attention to identify it precisely. What is it saying? What is the specific concern? What is the exact sentence? Hearing is not obeying. You can hear fear with full clarity and then choose your response deliberately. The person who cannot hear fear because they are performing fearlessness will be governed by it from below in the behavioral decisions they make without ever admitting the influence. Hear it clearly, name it specifically. That act of honest hearing is where the correction begins. Refuse to identify with it. Once the fear is heard and named, practice the separation of self from the signal. You are not the fear, you are not defined by it. You are not someone for whom this fear is the permanent and accurate description of their relationship with supply. The fear is a signal arising in the nervous system, shaped by memory and anticipation, doing its job of alerting. But it is not you. It is not the source's verdict on your situation. It is not a prophecy. It is a signal from the past, trying to govern the present. The moment of refusing to identify with the fear, of saying internally, "This is a signal I am observing, not a truth I am endorsing," is a moment of significant inner authority. Replace with a source statement, not a generic affirmation plastered over the fear like a bandage over a wound. A genuine, deliberately chosen statement of source-centered truth, directed at the specific fear that has just been heard. If the fear says there is never enough, the source statement says, "The source is infinite, supply is moving through more channels than I can currently see. I am open." If the fear says this will fail, the source statement says, "I release the how to the source. I hold the image of the desired outcome. I take the faithful action before me." The source statement is not louder than the fear, it is truer than the fear. And repeated with increasing sincerity, it begins to replace the fear's signal at the level of the creative frequency. Relax the body. The body has been holding the fear in physical form, in the tightened muscles, the shallow breath, the elevated shoulders, the braced abdomen. And the continued physical tension of fear maintains the fear's signal in the nervous system even after the mind has made the correction. Deliberately relax the body. Take a slow, full breath. Release the tension in the shoulders. Unclench the jaw. This is not a side practice, this is a central one, because the physical relaxation is the body's participation in the correction, and the formless substance responds to the whole person, mind and body together, not only to the words spoken by the mind over a body that is still broadcasting fear. Take one faithful action. After the hearing, the refusal of identification, the source statement and the physical relaxation, there is one more element that completes the correction and makes it genuinely transformational rather than merely internal. Take one faithful action in the direction of the desired outcome, the specific faithful action that you know is before you, the one that fear has been preventing. The message to be sent, the account to be reviewed, the offer to be made, the conversation to be had. One action, not the entire solution, the next faithful step. This action is the behavioral confirmation of the inner correction. It tells the law, with the language of movement, that the correction is real and the trust is not merely theoretical. Record the result. After you have taken the faithful action, write down what occurred. Not only the visible result, which may or may not yet be apparent, but the inner result. The quality of the experience of taking the action in spite of fear. The degree to which the fear's predicted catastrophe actually materialized, which in most cases will be significantly less than the fear proposed. The ways in which the action opened something, however small, that the non-action would have kept closed. The record is a practice of building evidence for the law, Because the fearful mind has spent years building evidence for fear, you are now beginning to build evidence for faith. And the record, maintained consistently over time, will become a testimony that changes the creative signal at the deepest level. You are not ruled by fear. This is not an aspiration. It is a statement of your actual nature as a person in relationship with an infinite source. Fear has been a governance, but governance is not nature. The governance can change. What does not change is the fundamental truth of your relationship with the source. You are a receiver, situated in the field of formless substance, capable of directing your inner state toward the mental image of the desired condition, and capable of holding that image with sufficient faith to cooperate with the law of invisible supply. That is who you are, not who you are trying to become, who you are. Fear has been confusing the role it was given with the authority it was never meant to hold. Your source is not your bank account. Say that again to yourself, slowly, with full attention to what it means. Your source is not your bank account. Your source is not your employer. Your source is not your primary client. Your source is not the single visible channel through which supply has been flowing. All of those things are channels, and channels can close and open and redirect. But the source behind all of them does not close, does not dry up, does not leave. The source is the infinite, intelligent, responsive, creative medium that Wattles described, and it is not subject to the limitations of any single visible channel. When the channel closes, the source redirects to another. Your supply is not in the channel. Your supply is in the source. Fear is not your source. You said this at the beginning of this teaching, when you made the comment that began this practice. And now you have traveled through the full diagnosis of how fear operates, how it blocks receiving, how it rejects delivery, how it disguises itself as wisdom and responsibility and maturity. And having traveled through all of that, you can say it again with a depth and specificity that was not available at the beginning. Fear is not your source, not only as a statement of what you want to be true, as a description of the actual law operating behind your life. Fear has no creative power over supply except the power you give it by making it your inner governing state. Remove that governance, return to the source. That is the new identity. You can move with faith before fear disappears. This is the identity of the practical practitioner of the certain way, not the identity of someone who has conquered fear permanently and lives in a state of perpetual serenity, undisturbed by any financial signal from the visible world. That identity does not produce supply any more than this one does. The identity that produces supply is the identity of someone who hears the fear, acknowledges it honestly, refuses to obey it as law, and takes the faithful action anyway. That person is not fearless. They are faithful in the presence of fear. And that faithfulness, practiced consistently, is the identity from which the law can work. That is who you are choosing to be. The shift from fear-governed to source-centered does not happen in a single dramatic event. It happens in the accumulation of small corrections, repeated over time, each one building the faith muscle, each one expanding the receiving capacity, each one narrowing the authority of fear and widening the authority of trust. But there is a moment in the practice of this shift when a genuine inner change becomes noticeable, when the body relaxes differently in the presence of financial uncertainty, when the mind goes first to the source rather than first to the threat, when an unexpected channel appears and the immediate inner response is openness rather than suspicion. That moment arrives through practice, and the practice is exactly what this teaching has been describing. The new financial identity is not a wealthy persona you perform. It is a spiritually grounded receiver you become. The person who genuinely knows that the source is infinite, that supply is always moving, that fear is a signal and not a sovereign, and that the law cooperates with the clear, faith-grounded, action-taking mind. That person does not need certainty before trust. They do not need proof before the step. They do not need the full bridge before the first plank. They need the source, the image, the faith, and the nearest open door. They have all four, and they are walking. Fear looks responsible. This is the first and most important thing to remember from this teaching. The fear that has been blocking your supply did not introduce itself as fear. It introduced itself as caution, realism, maturity, and wisdom. It sounded like the voice of experience. It sounded like the counsel of people who had learned through hard lessons, and all of that respectability is what made it so effective as a barrier. Because you do not question what you have named wisdom. You follow it. Now you know to question it. When the contraction arrives dressed in responsible language, you know to ask, is this wisdom, or is this fear wearing wisdom's clothing? Fear contracts receiving. The mechanism is now clear to you. Fear narrows perception. It rejects unfamiliar channels. It creates grasping. It delays action. It bolts the door from the inside. And all of these behaviors look like different things from the outside, but they are all the same inner event. The closing of the receiver against incoming supply. You are now capable of recognizing that event at the behavioral level, which means you are capable of interrupting it before it completes its work. The contraction is identifiable. The identification is the beginning of the correction. Fear filters channels. The specific way in which fear blocks supply is not usually a global blockage that stops all supply from moving. It is a filtering that evaluates every incoming channel through the threat assessment lens and disqualifies most of them before genuine investigation occurs. The unexpected person, the unfamiliar form, the small beginning, the fast offer, the strange idea, these are all filtered out by fear's pre-approval requirement. Now you know to apply the faith filter first, to ask not, is this safe, as the primary question, but is this a channel? And to pursue the genuine investigation that distinguishes between a real concern and a fear projection. The source remains infinite. This is the constant against which all visible limitation must be measured. However the visible world appears today, the source has not changed. The formless substance has not become less responsive. The invisible supply has not dried up. The channels that are presently closed represent exactly one category of visible circumstance that the infinite source can work around, redirect, replace, and exceed with equal ease. The viewer who has been staring at the closed door needs to expand their field of vision, to include the source behind all doors, which is not subject to the closure of any single channel. The source is infinite. That fact does not change in the presence of visible limitation. The receiver must reopen. This is your responsibility in the law, and it is a responsibility you are fully capable of fulfilling. The source is providing. The supply is moving. The channels will open. But the receiver must be open enough to perceive, trust, and act upon the channels as they appear. The reopening is the work of this teaching. Every correction practice, every source statement, every faithful action taken in the presence of fear, every relaxation of the body in the moment of financial anxiety, every comment of fear is not my source, typed as a declaration of inner truth, is a movement toward the reopening. The receiver is reopening. That is what is happening right now. Faith is the authority. In the vocabulary of the masters, faith is not a feeling. It is a faculty. It is the capacity to hold the mental image of the desired condition against the evidence of the visible world, with enough steadiness and sincerity that the formless substance receives the signal clearly and moves supply in the direction of the image. That faculty is in you. It may be underdeveloped from years of giving authority to fear instead. It may be weak in some areas and stronger in others, but it is there and it is growing. Every time you choose the source statement over the fear sentence, faith is growing. Every time you take the faithful action through the nervousness, faith is growing. Faith is the authority, and it is becoming your authority. You do not need to become fearless overnight. That is not the condition the law requires of you, and it is not the expectation of any teaching in the genuine master's tradition. The masters themselves were not people who had eliminated all experience of uncertainty, limitation, or fear. They were people who had learned to maintain the inner authority of faith over the inner impulse of fear, consistently enough and genuinely enough that the law could work through them in the direction of their desired good. That is not fearlessness. That is mastery of the relationship between faith and fear. And mastery is not achieved in a day. It is built through practice, through correction, through repeated return to the source when fear has temporarily reclaimed the center. What you need, and what is now available to you, is not the perfect absence of fear, but the consistent refusal to obey fear as if it were God. That distinction is everything. You can feel the fear and still hold the image. You can hear the fear signal and still return to the source statement. You can experience the full weight of financial uncertainty and still take the one faithful action that is before you. The goal is not the elimination of the experience of fear. The goal is the demotion of fear from the throne of inner governance to the position of an informational signal that is heard, assessed, and then subordinated to the authority of faith and the trust of the source. You have been sincere. That matters. The person sitting with this teaching has not been lazy in their spiritual life. They have not been indifferent to growth. They have been trying, genuinely and consistently, to align with the law, to trust the source, to practice the teachings, to hold the faith. And the reason this teaching is necessary is not that they have been dishonest or faithless, but that they have been carrying a very convincing lie. The lie that their fear is wisdom, and the lie has been doing its work without being recognized for what it is. Sincerity is the foundation. What is being added to it is precision, the ability to distinguish between genuine wisdom and fear wearing wisdom's clothing. The supply that fear has been delaying is not gone. Nothing in this teaching should be received as evidence that the supply you have been seeking has been permanently blocked by the years of fear-governed receiving. The law does not work that way. Supply is not held against the receiver as punishment for past fear. The formless substance is always responsive to the current inner state. The moment the receiver begins to genuinely shift from fear governance to source-centered trust, the moment the correction practices begin and the faithful actions follow, the law begins to move in the direction of the shift. The provision that has been waiting does not require years of perfect practice before it begins to arrive. It requires a genuine change of inner direction, and that change is happening now. The emotional journey you have been on in this teaching has asked a great deal of you. It has asked you to see clearly what fear has been doing in your financial life. And clear sight of a painful truth requires courage. It has asked you to take responsibility for inner states that you may have believed were simply responses to external conditions, and taking that responsibility requires honesty. It has asked you to practice correction in the presence of fear that is loud and long established, and that practice requires perseverance. You have stayed with this teaching. You have heard what was difficult to hear. That staying, that hearing, that willingness to be genuinely confronted by the law is itself evidence that the faith is alive in you. It has always been alive in you. It is simply learning to govern. The final reinforcement is this: the source has not given up on you. The invisible supply has not been redirected away from your life in response to your fear. The formless substance is not keeping score of the fear signals you have sent and reducing your provision accordingly. The source is infinitely patient, infinitely resourced, and infinitely ready to respond to the signal of genuine, faith-grounded desire held by an open receiver. You are becoming that open receiver. The practices are the path. The corrections are the work. The faithful actions are the cooperation. And the supply that moves through all of it is not yours to manufacture. It is yours to receive. And you are reopening to it now. For 7 days, beginning from the moment this teaching ends and continuing through every morning, every moment of financial anxiety, every encounter with a fear sentence, every instance of the body's tightening in the presence of visible limitation, you are going to practice one simple, powerful, specific ritual. Every time fear rises, and it will rise, you will say these exact words: "Fear is not my source, I return to the source." Say them deliberately. Say them with the full weight of what you now understand about how fear operates, how it blocks receiving, how it has been disguising itself as wisdom in your financial life. Say them as an interruption. Say them as a correction. Say them as a declaration of the inner authority that faith is taking back from the governance of fear. After you say the declaration, take one calm, faithful action. Not a dramatic gesture, not a grand commitment, not the entire solution to the entire financial situation. One small, specific, faithful action that is available to you in the present moment. Send the message, look at the account, make the call, say yes to the offer, accept the support, present the offering, write down the desire. Whatever the nearest door is for you in that specific moment, step toward it. The declaration without the action is a statement. The declaration with the action is a practice. And the practice is what transforms the identity from fear-governed to source-centered over the 7 days and beyond. The 7 days are not a magic period after which the practice ends and the old fear returns by default. They are the beginning of a new habitual direction. 7 days of consistent practice create a new groove in the inner life, a new default toward which the mind begins to move when financial fear arises. You are not trying to complete the transformation in 7 days. You are trying to establish the direction, to create the initial momentum of the correction, to build enough evidence in the record of your own experience that faith produces better outcomes than fear, and then to continue from there. The 7 days are the beginning of the permanent practice. They are the seed of the new financial identity. Plant them deliberately. When the 7 days are complete, or as the practice unfolds through them, come back to this teaching. Write in the comments what happened, not because a public report is required for the law to work, but because the act of articulating what occurred in the practice is itself a consolidation of the inner change. When you write, "Fear rose and I said the declaration, and I took the action and this is what followed," you are building your testimony. You are recording the evidence of the law. And that record, shared here in community with others who are practicing the same correction, becomes a testimony that strengthens the practice for everyone reading it. Come back. Report. Continue. If this teaching has reached something in you that needs to be continued, that deserves to be continued, the invitation is simple and standing. Subscribe to the Master's legacy. Stay with this channel through the full depth of what the Masters actually taught. Not the simplified version, not the comfortable highlights, but the real teaching, the precise laws of mind, source, receiving, faith, channel, and invisible supply that these Masters spent their lives articulating. Like this video so that the law it carries can reach other sincere people who are sitting tonight in financial fear, believing that the source has abandoned them, not knowing that the door has been locked from the inside and that the key is in their hands. Share it with someone who needs to hear this. The teaching is only as useful as the reach it is given. Write in the comments the phrase you declared at the beginning of this teaching. Write it again now as a close. Fear is not my source, not as the mechanical repetition of a phrase you heard once and are performing for an algorithm, as the genuine inner correction of a person who has traveled the full length of this teaching and knows now, with greater clarity and greater precision than when they began, exactly what those words mean. What fear has been doing, how it has been disguising itself, what the law requires of the receiver, what the source is waiting to provide. Write it now with the full weight of that understanding. You came to this teaching with something specific. You came with the fear that has been traveling with you as a financial companion for longer than you care to count. You came knowing, intellectually, that the source is abundant, but living emotionally in the grip of a fear that told you abundance was for other people, that provision was uncertain, that the closed doors meant the source had stopped answering. And if you have been honest with yourself through this teaching, if you have allowed the diagnosis to land rather than deflecting it with spiritual composure, something has shifted. Not everything. Not permanently and certainly not perfectly, but something has shifted in the direction of clarity. You see the fear now, you know its name, you know its disguises, you have the correction practice, you have the 7-day challenge. You are no longer in the same position you occupied at the beginning. The source has not changed. The invisible supply has not relocated. The formless substance is as responsive right now, in this moment after this teaching, as it was before you carried any fear at all. What has changed is you. Specifically, what has changed is your ability to see what has been operating, to name it with precision, and to choose deliberately and with increasing confidence to return to the source rather than to obey the fear. That choice, made once, is significant. Made twice, it is practice. Made daily, it is a new identity. Made consistently over time, it is the certain way. And the certain way leads without exception in the direction of the provision, the peace, the financial freedom, and the source-centered life that you have been seeking. The money was not always far away. The supply was not always absent. The source was not waiting to respond. Sometimes it was right there, present and moving, already dispatched, already in motion through a channel that was unfamiliar or unexpected, or smaller than expected, or faster than fear approved. And what stood between the supply and its arrival in your visible life was not the insufficiency of the source. It was not the complexity of the law. It was not the unworthiness of the receiver. It was a door, and the door was locked from the inside. And the one who held the key was you. The teaching has been delivered. The key is in your hand. Open the door.